All right, let's talk about the First World War. It's one of those huge, defining moments in history, but so much of what we think we know about it, well, it's just plain wrong. Today, we're going to dig in and bust some of the biggest myths that still surround the Great War. So, when I say World War I, what pops into your head? I bet it's a scene just like this. Mud, endless trenches, guys going over the top, right? Maybe some old-timey biplanes in the sky. It's a really powerful image, but it's only a tiny, tiny piece of the picture. Because the real story, wow, it is so much more interesting. We're talking about a war of incredible, fast-paced innovation fought on literally every continent but Antarctica. This was an event that violently redrew the map of the world in ways we still feel today. So let's start right where the action is. Our first section, Myths of the Battlefield. Because how the war was actually fought, that's where some of the biggest misunderstandings are. Okay, myth number one, the whole war was just trench warfare. And yeah, those massive, complex trench systems are the icon of the war, for sure. But they were almost exclusively a feature of the Western Front. Out on the vast, wide-open spaces of the Eastern Front, or in the deserts of the Middle East, we're talking about a war of movement, where cavalry, actual horses, still played a huge role. The ground was just totally different. And then there's the war in the sky. The myth is this romantic picture of a gentleman's war, these chivalrous aces and their scars, dueling one-on-one like knights. The reality? It was absolutely brutal. By the later years, you had huge formations of planes fighting it out with deadly machine guns. And that glamorous title of ace, it hid a terrifying truth. For a brand new pilot, life expectancy could be as short as a few hours. And here's something we almost never talk about: the war at sea. This was no sideshow. You had the Battle of Jutland, the biggest naval battle in all of history. But the real war was this giant, deadly chess game. The British Royal Navy blockaded Germany, slowly starving it of food and supplies. Germany fought back with its U-boats, trying to do the exact same thing to Britain. Winning on the ocean was absolutely crucial. Which brings me to this idea that the generals were just clueless, repeating the same mistakes for 4 years. That's totally false. This war forced constant, painful innovation. They started in 1914 using tactics from the last century, but by 1918, you're seeing the birth of modern warfare. They were figuring out how to coordinate tanks, planes, and infantry all at once. This is the direct ancestor of the blitzkrieg tactics of World War II. And all that innovation wasn't just happening in France. It was happening all over the planet. Which brings us to our next point, because this wasn't just some European squabble. This was, in every single way, a true world war. Again, the picture in our heads is pretty narrow, isn't it? French, British, and German soldiers fighting over the same patch of ground in Belgium and France. But honestly, that's just one chapter in a much, much bigger story. The reality? Well, it was this. Just look at this list. The sheer scale is mind-blowing. There were massive fronts in the Italian Alps, the deserts of Palestine, on the beaches of Gallipoli, and across huge parts of Africa. People from every single inhabited continent fought in this war. The Western Front was just one piece of a giant global jigsaw puzzle. So, if we've got the where and the how wrong, what about the who? Let's move on and challenge some of our ideas about the countries that fought. It's time for Rethinking the Players. Let's talk about Russia. The common story is that their army was just a big, clumsy, backward force. And yes, they suffered some unbelievable disasters, like the Battle of Tannenberg. But the full story is way more complicated. In 1916, their Brusilov offensive was so devastatingly effective, it almost knocked Austria-Hungary clean out of the war. All the while, their factories were modernizing at an incredible rate. Russia was no pushover. Okay, this next one. This is one of the most persistent and dangerous myths to come out of the war, one that directly helped cause the next one. So, was the German army really undefeated and just stabbed in the back by politicians at home? The answer is a clear and simple no. They were beaten decisively on the battlefield. By summer 1918, their last-ditch attacks had failed, and the army was falling apart. Supplies were gone, morale was shattered, and their allies were surrendering one after another. And here's the kicker. It was the German military leaders themselves who demanded that the government ask for a ceasefire because they knew the army was about to break completely. This all leads us into some really tricky, sensitive territory. If we're rethinking the players, we have to talk about blame. So this next section is called A War Without Villains.
Look, the Treaty of Versailles put all the blame squarely on Germany, and there's no denying the horrific atrocities they committed, like in occupied Belgium. But the bigger historical picture is more complicated. The truth is, back then, all the great powers of Europe saw war as a perfectly normal way to get what they wanted. And tragically, atrocities happened on all sides. Now, that doesn't excuse any of it, but it does show that the simple story of a single bad guy just doesn't hold up.
And maybe this quote just sums it up perfectly. It's a tough thought, and it doesn't give us any easy answers, but it's powerful. Sometimes there is no bad guy. Sometimes everyone's the bad guy.
So, after all that, after taking apart all these common myths, you'd think we have a pretty clear picture now, right? Well, that leads us to our final and maybe most surprising section, the unfinished story. Because here's the last big myth, that a war that ended over 100 years ago is a closed book, that we found out everything there is to find out. The story's over. But that couldn't be more wrong. History is alive. It's constantly changing. For example, Edith Cavell, the famous British nurse the Germans executed. We now know she actually was a spy. Or the whole German strategy at Verdun to bleed Franz white. New research suggests that was probably made up after the battle to justify the insane number of casualties. And get this, governments are still declassifying files about the war today. The story is changing right under our noses. And that, to me, is the most exciting thing of all. It's a reminder that the past isn't set in stone. It leaves us with this amazing question. If our understanding of an event this huge is still changing a century later, what on earth are we going to discover next?